Antarctica, a place where even the wind seems to have forgotten how to speak. The vast, empty expanse stretched endlessly before them, a flat sheet of ice and snow painted in hues of white and gray under the faint, dying light of the distant sun. The air was bitter, sharp enough to cut through any exposed skin in seconds. The world felt hollow here, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. It just was. The horizon was a blur, the landscape swallowed by swirling winds that kicked up plumes of snow, rendering everything in a thick, oppressive haze. The sky above was not blue, but a washed-out gray, where the light barely touched the frozen ground. The only sounds were the endless screeching of the wind and the crunch of boots against the hard-packed snow as the men trudged forward, trying to make sense of this icy wasteland. Their breath came out in visible clouds, quickly evaporating into the air, as if even the breath of life could not last in such an inhospitable place. Lieutenant Thomas "Tom" Harris, his face weathered by years of combat, squinted into the endless white expanse. He had fought across Europe, seen towns fall, armies retreat, and whole cities burn, but this was something different. There was no battlefield here, no land to reclaim or defend, just ice. Nothing but the cold, silent embrace of a land that didn't care whether they lived or died. His tank crew moved methodically, checking their equipment as they made their way toward what they knew would be an almost impossible task: surviving here. Behind them, the distant rumble of artillery thundered, a reminder that the war was still out there, still pressing forward. But the frozen plains of Antarctica felt like a different war entirely. A war against nature, against time. The cold gnawed at their bones, stripping away any sense of warmth, of comfort. The tanks, meant for battlefields of mud and dirt, struggled to function here. They were machines of war, not meant to plow through the snow and ice of a place that had never known combat. Harris pulled his collar tighter against the wind and took in the sight of his tanks, their heavy armor coated in frost, the treads barely turning against the unforgiving snow. They weren't made for this. They weren't even supposed to be here. But here they were, and for Harris, the battle already felt lost. Not against the enemy, but against everything this place had to offer. The terrain, the cold, the crushing isolation of a land that swallowed men whole. But in war, you did what you had to. Even here, on the edge of the world, you fought, you adapted, or you died. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous than any enemy. And Harris knew it. Lieutenant Thomas Harris surveyed the frozen wasteland before him, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. The wind howled, sweeping across the icy plains, scattering snow like sand across a desert. His men trudged behind him, heads bowed, their faces covered with scarves and goggles, their hands stiff in the biting cold. This was no ordinary battlefield. There were no trenches, no cover, no semblance of what they had trained for. Just the relentless, unforgiving expanse of Antarctica. The soldiers moved in silence, as if afraid to disturb the stillness of the land. Each step felt like a small victory against the cold, each breath a reminder of the harsh reality they faced. Their boots crunched against the snow, a sound that felt amplified in the eerie quiet of the wasteland. For most, this would be the closest they ever came to understanding what it meant to be truly alone, not a single soul for miles. Nothing but the white void and the roaring wind. Harris could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. This was supposed to be a routine supply run, nothing more. A convoy crossing this remote part of Antarctica to deliver essential goods to a forward base, but nothing had gone according to plan. The tanks were barely functional in these extreme conditions, and the supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations seemed to mock them as they sat idle in the trucks, unable to move forward because of the snow. His crew, all seasoned veterans of numerous battles across Europe, seemed out of place here. Private Jacobs, the youngest of the group, had his eyes constantly darting around, clearly unnerved by the desolation. Sergeant McCarthy, his second in command, muttered under his breath as he struggled with the frozen machinery, his breath heavy with frustration. Even Corporal Clark, the always unshakable driver, was unnervingly quiet as he checked the tank's engine, his gloved hands stiff from the cold. Harris knew their spirits were just as frozen as the ground beneath them. They were used to combat they had fought in Normandy, in Italy, in the heart of Europe, but this was something entirely different. Here, there was no enemy to fight but the elements. No trenches to crawl through, no towns to liberate. Here, they had nothing but each other and the will to survive. The tanks groaned as they started, their engines sputtering in protest against the cold. Harris gave the order to move out, but it was clear that even the tanks weren't entirely ready for what lay ahead. The snow was deep, the terrain treacherous. With each lurch forward, the weight of the machines seemed to sink them further into the ground, as though the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. Yet, despite everything, the cold, the bleak landscape, the mounting sense of dread, Harris felt a flicker of determination. His crew was still here. They hadn't given up yet, and that, he knew, meant there was still hope. They would push forward, no matter the cost. Because here, on the edge of the world, survival was their only mission. The tanks, designed to thunder across battlefields of mud and debris, now groaned and hissed as they struggled against the relentless cold. Each breath of the engines was ragged, the exhaust plumes mingling with the icy air, only to freeze in mid-air. The machines, once symbols of raw power, were now crippled by the unforgiving Antarctic conditions. The cold seeped into their very bones, freezing the fuel lines, jamming the gears, and rendering them nearly immobile. Lieutenant Harris watched as the crew worked frantically to coax life into the massive machines. He could hear the mechanical whine of the treads as they attempted to churn through the thick snow, but each movement was sluggish, hesitant, as if the very land itself was fighting back. The tanks weren't built for this. They weren't meant to function in sub-zero temperatures, where every piece of metal became brittle and every fluid froze solid. The crew was doing everything they could to keep the tanks operational, but their efforts were futile against the cold. Corporal Clark, the driver, was leaning over the engine compartment, his breath fogging up the frozen metal as he worked to clear a clogged fuel line. His gloved hands trembled as he struggled with the tools, each movement stiff and awkward from the cold. Behind him, Sergeant McCarthy cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the frozen landscape for any signs of hope. But there was none, just endless snow and the gnawing wind. As they worked, Harris felt a growing sense of helplessness. The weight of the tanks, the lifeblood of their mission, was becoming an anchor, dragging them deeper into the snow with every passing moment. He knew that if they didn't get the engines running soon, they'd be stuck here, frozen in place, waiting for supplies that might never arrive. His gaze shifted to the trucks behind them, the convoy that was supposed to follow them across the ice. But even the trucks were struggling, their tires sinking into the snow, their engines sputtering as the cold took its toll. "Move it, damn it!" Harris shouted, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the wind. But it was no use. The tanks, once the kings of the battlefield, were now immobilized by the very element they had never been built to conquer. The men worked tirelessly, fighting against time and the freezing temperatures. But with each failed attempt, the reality of their situation became more and more apparent. Harris walked to the front of the tank, his boots crunching in the snow. He could see the frustration on his men's faces, the disbelief that something as simple as the cold could halt their advance. They had fought in jungles, deserts, and the streets of cities. They had faced down artillery, tanks, and the enemy's best. On this frozen battlefield, They were helpless. The sound of another engine sputtering to a halt broke Harris from his thoughts. He turned to see Jacobs, the youngest of the crew, his face pale as he looked up at Harris with wide, frightened eyes. "Lieutenant," Jacobs said, his voice shaking, "the engine. It's done for. I can't get it started." Harris sighed, a heavy, defeated breath. He knew what that meant. The cold had claimed another machine. They were stranded. The tanks had failed them. And the worst part was that they had no backup, no support. Just a handful of men against a wilderness that didn't care if they survived or not. But Harris refused to let the despair take root. He clenched his fists, feeling the cold bite at his skin. "We're not done yet," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We'll make it work. We always do." His words were hollow, even to him, but it was all he could offer. The war was still out there, and so was the enemy. And if they didn't find a way across this frozen wasteland, the war would catch up to them. Time was running out, and Harris knew that the longer they stood still, the harder it would be to keep the fight alive. They had no choice but to press on. The wind screamed through the frozen expanse of Antarctica, biting at their faces and tearing across the battlefield like an invisible beast. Harris squinted into the swirling blizzard, trying to make sense of the world around him. The snowstorm had thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. The tanks, now barely functional, sat like colossal, frozen monuments to futility in the snow. The convoy, still stranded behind him, remained motionless, each truck and tank caught in the same struggle for survival against the elements. And then, through the white fog, came the unmistakable sound, a low rumble, like thunder gathering in the distance. Harris's pulse quickened. In a place like this, where silence should reign, any sound, especially the growl of an engine, was enough to snap attention. His soldiers stiffened, their eyes scanning the horizon. McCarthy, who had been watching the tank's engine in frustration, turned abruptly. "Lieutenant," McCarthy called, his voice strained with urgency. "We've got company." Harris didn't need to ask who. His instincts kicked in. The unmistakable outline of enemy tanks began to take shape in the distance, barely visible through the blizzard, their outlines like shadowy ghosts against the whiteness. Even at a distance, he could see the cold gleam of their metal hulls, designed to endure a different kind of war. The enemy had arrived. Harris cursed under his breath. This wasn't just bad luck. The Germans were masters of warfare, and here, in the frozen wilderness, they had come prepared, their tanks, well-maintained, well-equipped to survive in the biting cold. This wasn't a typical battlefield where a tank's engine could fail or its treads could freeze. The enemy tanks were built to withstand the brutal conditions of this land. It was a stark reminder of the gap between their forces and the enemy's strength. His heart pounded as he looked to his men. Their tanks, sluggish and half-frozen, were no match for the enemy's full-on assault. But there was no retreat. There was no fallback. The icy wasteland offered no escape, no cover, no trench to hide in. With no choice but to fight or die trying. Through the snow, Harris could make out the German tanks moving with precision, their treads cutting through the frozen terrain like it was just another day on the battlefield. There was no hesitation in their movements. They had the advantage, a clear sight line through the swirling snow and a better grip on the cold. Harris wiped his goggles and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The air felt thick with the weight of the moment. He glanced at his men, each of them frozen in place, eyes wide with disbelief. But the enemy wouldn't wait. They were coming for them, and time was running out. "Get to your positions," Harris shouted, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "We can't outrun them, but we can make them pay for every inch they take." McCarthy nodded, immediately jumping into action. The rest of the crew followed, scrambling into their positions, eyes focused, hands working mechanically as they prepared for the inevitable. The roar of the German tanks grew louder, a sound that seemed to magnify with every passing second, drowning out the wind and the freezing cold. Harris's mind raced as he mentally prepared for what would likely be their final stand. The snow had become a cruel barrier between them and their goal. The tanks, caught between a battle of steel and the brutal elements, were at the mercy of both forces. But Harris refused to surrender. He looked at the German tanks, knowing that if they didn't act now, the war would be over for them before they had a chance to fight. He turned his gaze to the icy river ahead, the cold expanse of the battlefield stretching before him. There was no turning back. The battle wasn't just against the Germans, it was against nature itself, and the only thing Harris knew for certain was that they would not go down quietly. The silence of Antarctica, as deep and unnatural as it was, shattered in an instant. The wind howled, but for a brief moment, the world was still. Then came the unmistakable sound, a thunderous crack that split the air, echoing across the ice like the roar of a beast. The first shot fired. The enemy tank had opened fire, its gun roaring through the blizzard with brutal clarity. The sound vibrated through Harris's chest, as though the entire frozen wasteland had been struck at once. The shell tore through the air, a blinding flash of light that barely registered against the gray sky, and slammed into the ground just to their left. Snow and ice erupted in a violent geyser, sending debris flying in every direction. The shockwave rippled through the air, sending tremors through the frozen earth beneath their boots. Harris barely had time to react. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound of the explosion reverberated in his ears. The air was filled with a cloud of snow and ice, thick and choking. His men ducked instinctively, pressing their faces into the cold, stinging snow as the shock of the blast hit them. The once muted landscape was now alive with noise, the hiss of gas escaping from the ruptured tank, the crunch of snow underfoot as soldiers scrambled for cover. "Return fire!" Harris barked, his voice cutting through the chaos, hoarse and urgent. He grabbed the radio, his fingers stiff from the cold, and shouted for support. But the transmission was weak, the crackling static barely audible over the storm. Their position was compromised. The first shot had been a warning, but Harris knew it wouldn't be the last. Another shot rang out, this one closer. It hit the snow, sending another shockwave that rattled Harris's teeth. His mind raced, calculating. The enemy had the advantage of mobility. Their tanks were built for cold weather, equipped to endure the harsh Antarctic elements. His crew, in contrast, was dealing with frozen engines and stiff treads, barely able to maneuver. The enemy's tanks, sleek and deadly, were built for a battlefield of this nature, not just for war, but for survival in these exact conditions. Harris felt his pulse quicken as he glanced over at his crew. Jacobs, still young and wide-eyed, was already at the gunner's position, his hands shaking as he tried to adjust the sights. McCarthy, ever steady, was manning the radio, his brow furrowed as he muttered into the receiver. The tank shuddered under another hit, and Harris could hear the strain in the machine's gears, groaning under the weight of both war and the cold. "Fire!" Harris ordered. The command sharp and clear. The tank's gun recoiled, sending a blast of fire into the snow-filled air. The round shot out, a bright flash of heat against the icy landscape, but the enemy tank was already moving, swiftly taking cover behind a snowbank. The shot missed, but the battle was now in full swing. The snow, once a quiet and haunting landscape, was becoming a backdrop to the thunder of artillery. Each shot fired, each explosion felt, reminded Harris that this wasn't just another skirmish. This wasn't a battle of strategy and tactics. This was a fight for survival in an unforgiving place. The enemy wasn't just trying to win. They were trying to survive, just like him. The ground was shifting beneath them, the stakes rising with every passing second. And then, the real fight began not just against the enemy's tanks, but against the land itself, which had grown more hostile with every moment they stood still. Harris tightened his grip on the tank's controls, his jaw set, eyes narrowed in the face of the blizzard. They were still here, still standing. The battle had only just begun. The relentless crack of enemy shells seemed to be the only constant in the blizzard. Explosions erupted around them, sending up geysers of snow and ice, each blast a reminder of the ever-present danger. Harris could feel the weight of the tank beneath him, but not in the way he was used to. The machine wasn't responding as it should. The engine sputtered again, the grinding sound of its gears straining against the cold air, and for a moment, Harris thought it had stalled completely. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Slamming his fist against the dashboard, the cold seeped through his gloves, a constant reminder that time was slipping away. And every second spent fighting machinery was a second lost to the enemy. Engines failing again. "Lieutenant," Jacobs called from the gunner's seat, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've got no response from the power system. We're stuck." The tank's engines had been freezing up intermittently ever since they'd entered the battlefield. The snow, the bitter wind, and the icy conditions had seeped into every crack and crevice. They were no longer a formidable force. The machines were slowing to a crawl, groaning with every attempt to move. McCarthy, crouched next to the radio, was busy with the communication equipment, but he looked up at Harris, his face grim. "We can't get any support through the radio, sir. The static's too thick, the enemy's jamming us, and the blizzard's swallowing our signals." Harris gritted his teeth, hands tight around the control handles. He needed to think. The Germans were still out there, still closing in, and they had nothing but the few malfunctioning tanks and broken equipment left at their disposal. The cold had made sure that nothing functioned as it should. Even the most basic tasks had become Herculean efforts. "We don't have the luxury of time," Harris growled, looking out at the horizon where the enemy tanks were still visible, slowly advancing through the storm, calculating their next move. They knew the terrain. They had the advantage. "Get me those tools," Harris barked, leaning out of the hatch. "We're going to fix this." The crew scrambled into action, their movements stiff, cold fingers fumbling in the dark as they grabbed what they could from the cluttered compartments inside the tank. Wrenches, spare parts, whatever they could scavenge. Harris knew they were running on empty. They didn't have time to think about precision. They had to improvise. To make do with whatever was left, Clark, the driver, was under the tank, working to clear the frozen fuel line. "She's frozen solid, Lieutenant. Nothing's moving," he shouted back. Harris knelt beside him, his breath visible in the biting air. "Then thaw it," he said, his voice unwavering despite the hopelessness of their situation. "Use the engine exhaust. Do whatever it takes to get this damn thing running again." Clark nodded, a look of determination in his eyes. The team moved like clockwork, each man doing whatever he could to get the machine functioning, if only for a few minutes more. It was chaotic, frantic. The tank's engine sputtered, coughed, and groaned as it fought the cold. But Harris didn't allow himself to think of failure. There was no room for it. Every malfunction, every failure to start, was a moment closer to death. And there was still a job to do. As the minutes dragged on and the enemy continued their slow advance, Harris could feel the pressure building. The tank was barely operational, the radio still a dead weight of static. They were here, in the middle of this frozen hell, and they had to make it work. The enemy had no intention of stopping. Neither could they. Harris wiped the snow and sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The tank rumbled back to life, albeit slowly, and Harris breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For now, "Let's go," he ordered, his voice sharp and resolute. They were far from fixed, far from prepared, but they were still moving. And that was all that mattered. The wind howled louder now. ripping across the battlefield with a savage intensity. It howled through the cracks in the tanks, through the layers of clothing, tearing at exposed skin. The snow had stopped falling, but the land was still shrouded in a thick mist of swirling ice and dust. Harris stared into the whiteness, eyes straining to see anything through the swirling storm. The enemy tanks were still out there, their silhouette barely visible through the storm. Harris knew their every movement would be a calculated step towards their demise if they didn't act fast. The Germans had a mastery over this terrain. They knew how to fight in this brutal cold. Their vehicles equipped for the ice, their tanks more reliable, and built to withstand everything this frozen hell could throw at them. They moved with precision, not a single hesitation as they maneuvered through the snow, even when it seemed like the world was conspiring against them. His own tanks, now barely functional, looked like tired beasts of war, slowly dragging their weight through the cold, the treads skipping over the surface like a sick joke. The engines grumbled, faltering with each turn of the wheel, refusing to obey, as if even the machines themselves were tired of the struggle. Harris felt the cold sink deeper into his bones. The worst part wasn't just the freezing air or the snow that threatened to engulf them. It was the helplessness gnawing at his insides. They couldn't run. They couldn't escape. There was no retreat on a battlefield like this. They were stuck between a frozen hell and an enemy that wouldn't let them go without a fight. "Lieutenant, we're easy targets out here," McCarthy's voice crackled from behind him. "We need to get out of the open. The tanks are coming." Harris knew that. The German tanks weren't just a physical threat, they were a mental one. The enemy had the firepower, the mobility, and the experience to defeat them easily. Their tanks were sleek and fast, built for environments like this. Unlike the heavy, sluggish machines that Harris and his men were trying to force to move, the Germans had them outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outclassed in every sense. Their tanks were moving forward steadily, cutting through the snow like predators on a hunt. Harris could almost feel the weight of each approaching step, the slow encroachment of the enemy, ready to strike. Every minute they waited, every moment they hesitated, would bring them one step closer to a brutal end. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Harris refused to admit defeat. He had seen too much in his years of service to accept the cold as a reason to give up. The enemy may have had the advantage, but they weren't invincible. The German tanks, though powerful, were not immune to mistakes. His mind raced, calculating the terrain, the movements, the weaknesses. He knew the land, and in the middle of a battle, when there was nothing left but survival, you didn't think about glory. You thought about making it out alive. "Move the tanks to that ridge," Harris said, his voice calm but filled with intent. "We'll use the terrain to block their line of sight. We need to make them play our game." McCarthy gave him a look, unsure, but nodded. The soldiers jumped into action, despite their frozen limbs and fatigue. It wasn't much, but it was a plan. They had to trust in the terrain. Now the hills, the snowdrifts, anything that could give them the slightest advantage. The enemy wasn't just fighting to win, they were fighting to survive, just like them. And that realization, sharp and clear, cut through the fear. Harris didn't need a perfect plan. He needed a way forward, however small. He needed his men to believe in one simple thing, that they weren't done yet. The German tanks were coming. But Harris wasn't about to make it easy. Not today. The heavy rumble of the enemy tanks grew louder, a constant reminder that time was running out. Harris could feel the cold biting deeper into his bones, the frost creeping through the seams of his uniform as the battle raged on. The enemy had closed the distance. The Germans were no longer distant shadows across the snow. They were right on top of them, their treads cutting through the frozen earth with precision and purpose. Harris's tanks, though barely functional, were still standing, but at this rate, he knew it wouldn't last much longer. "Lieutenant!" Jacobs's voice crackled over the intercom. sharp and urgent. "They're coming fast. We've got one chance and it's slipping away. What's the plan?" Harris's mind raced, sifting through possibilities. The landscape was unforgiving, a wasteland of snow and ice with little cover to speak of. The enemy had them outnumbered, and their tanks were faster, better equipped to navigate the terrain. But Harris had something the Germans didn't, a growing sense of resolve. His men, though exhausted and freezing, had an unshakable will to survive, and that was something the enemy had yet to understand. "We're not going to wait for them to come to us," Harris said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension. He turned to McCarthy, his second in command, who was hunched over the radio, eyes darting nervously between the maps and the horizon. "Move the tanks behind that ridge. Keep low. We're going to hit them from the side. Use the terrain to our advantage. We won't beat them head on, but we can make them pay for every inch they take." McCarthy hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "Understood, sir." The tanks began to shift, their engines straining against the cold as they maneuvered around the ridgeline. It was slow work, every movement feeling like an eternity as they crawled over the frozen landscape. But it was all they had. Every inch gained, every turn made, was another chance for survival. "On my mark," Harris called, his voice now a calm center in the midst of the chaos. "We make our move." The tanks, barely holding together, took their positions behind the ridge. The enemy had advanced too far to notice the shift in position. They were marching forward, confident that their superior firepower would break the Allied defenses in minutes. What they didn't realize was that Harris had baited them. The ridge, though an obstacle for his own tanks, was a perfect vantage point for ambush. "Now," Harris ordered. The roar of the engines filled the air as the tanks surged forward. Harris's tank, though sluggish, shot out from behind the ridge, charging at the enemy's flank. The surprise was immediate. The German tanks, caught off guard, struggled to adjust their position in time. Their guns fired, but the snow, the blinding white of the storm, and the chaos of battle obscured their aim. Harris's crew fired first, the cannon's blast shattering the silence, sending a shell hurtling toward the lead enemy tank. It hit with a deafening explosion, the tank's armor buckling under the force of the impact. The blast sent a shockwave through the frozen earth, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The enemy was no longer the unstoppable force they'd seemed. They were now vulnerable, caught in the open, unprepared for the ambush they had just walked into. "Direct hit!" Jacobs shouted over the intercom, his voice filled with disbelief. "We've got them! Keep going!" But Harris didn't let himself get caught up in the victory just yet. The battle was far from over. The enemy tanks, though damaged, were still formidable, and the terrain was working against them all. Harris's tank rumbled forward again, its gun tracking the next target. He knew the Germans would retaliate quickly, and if they couldn't finish the job, the momentum would swing back to them. But the tide had shifted. Harris could feel it in the air, in the tension that rippled through his men. This wasn't a battle of tanks anymore. It was a battle of will. And for the first time since the tanks had started moving across the frozen battlefield, Harris believed they could win. The wind howled through the battlefield, but Harris didn't hear it anymore. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the sharp tang of diesel. His mind was locked in a singular focus: survival. His men had fought their way through impossible odds, and now, for the first time, it seemed like they might have a shot at victory. The enemy tanks, though formidable, were beginning to falter. The blast from their own cannons no longer seemed invincible. "Keep moving!" Harris shouted, his voice hoarse but determined. "We've got them on the run!" The orders felt instinctive now, like he was no longer thinking, just reacting. His crew, once tired and frostbitten, now moved with purpose, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The tank rumbled beneath them, its engine pushing forward with more power than it had shown all day. It was battered, scarred by earlier blows, but it was still moving, and that, in this frozen hell, was a victory in itself. The first German tank had been hit, but it wasn't enough to stop the assault. Harris knew the moment he'd ordered the push that they were gambling everything. If they failed, they would be trapped, the enemy would overwhelm them, and the war would be over for them in the worst way. But now, as his tank roared forward, the enemy was backing off. The Germans were disoriented, unable to get a clear shot as the snow and smoke blanketed the battlefield. Harris could see the confusion in the enemy's movements, the hesitation in their fire. For all their tactical brilliance, they were fighting on unfamiliar ground. The icy terrain that had given them an advantage was now working against them, just as it had worked against Harris's own men. The ground was slick, the tank struggling to maintain traction, the cold sinking into every mechanical joint. "Hit them again!" McCarthy called out, his voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. The next shot tore into the flank of another German tank, sending it spinning and skidding across the snow. It was a direct hit, and this time, the enemy tank couldn't recover. It slid off course, the engine sputtering and dying, the crew inside scrambling for any chance to escape. Harris knew that even in war, there was no glory in taking lives, but in that moment, there was relief. The enemy was down. As the last of the German tanks fell back, Harris could see the final one retreating into the storm, its silhouette fading against the blizzard. Victory was within their grasp, but he knew better than to get caught up in it. His tank was barely functioning, the cold still gnawing at the joints and treads. The snow was still falling, thick and unforgiving, but now it felt different. It no longer carried the weight of hopelessness. Now, it was just weather. The fight wasn't over, but the victory had begun. "Clear the area," Harris ordered, his voice steady. "We hold this ground. Make sure those tanks don't come back." The men moved quickly, their hands numb but their actions instinctive. The battle had turned in their favor, but they weren't celebrating. There was no time for celebration. Not yet. They had fought through the worst conditions imaginable, and now the first wave of victory was theirs. As Harris stood there, watching the snow fall over the battlefield, he felt a strange, bittersweet satisfaction. They had done it. Against all odds, they had fought their way to the edge of victory. But the war was far from over. This was only a small victory in a much larger struggle. And for Harris, the fight for survival would never truly end. "We've got a long way to go," he muttered to himself. But this time, it didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like resolve. The Rhine was still ahead, and the battle for survival was far from over. But Harris knew one thing for certain. They were no longer helpless. They had made it this far, and somehow, against all odds, they would keep moving forward. The battle was over, but the landscape seemed unchanged, as if the war had never been fought here at all. The snow continued to fall, covering the twisted metal remains of the tanks, both Allied and German, in a blanket of white. The air was thick with the scent of burnt oil and metal, the sound of distant artillery and shell fire, now replaced by the heavy silence of exhaustion. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of machines that had once been symbols of power, now reduced to scrap, half buried in the snow. Harris stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breath visible in the frigid air, looking out over the wreckage. His uniform was stained with dirt and blood, the cold seeping through his clothes despite the layers. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a mix of relief and disbelief. They had done it. Against all odds, against the elements, they had won. But the victory felt hollow. The cost had been high. His crew was scattered around the area, busy attending to the damaged tanks and organizing the wounded. They had fought for survival, and now they were trying to make sense of the aftermath. Jacobs, still shaken from the battle, was helping McCarthy secure the radio equipment, his hands trembling as he worked. Clark, the driver, was wiping snow and blood from his face, his eyes distant, staring at the wreckage of the enemy tanks. Harris's mind kept replaying the moments of the battle, the sound of shells tearing through the air, the rumble of tanks, the cold biting into his skin as they fought, never stopping, never giving in. The Germans had been fierce, but they hadn't counted on the resilience of men like his crew, and yet that resilience had come at a price. "Lieutenant," McCarthy called, his voice quiet, "we've got the wounded sorted. The others are securing the perimeter." Harris turned to face him. McCarthy's face was grim, eyes tired, but there was a glimmer of something else. Pride, perhaps, or relief. "How's Jacobs?" Harris asked, his voice low. "Shaken up. But he'll be all right," McCarthy replied. "We all will. For now, anyway." Harris nodded, but the weight of it all still pressed on him. They were alive, yes, but at what cost? So many had been lost in the battle, and for what? A few feet of ground? A river that still stood between them and their final objective? He looked out at the battlefield again, his gaze drifting to the wreckage of the German tanks. The once pristine machines were now twisted hunks of metal, their crews either dead or scattered. The Germans had come with all the confidence of a well-trained army, but now they were retreating, their advance halted by the very thing that had driven them to Antarctica: survival. In that moment, Harris realized something important. It wasn't just about the enemy, the tanks, or the battlefield. It was about the men. His crew had fought not for glory or honor, but for the simple will to survive. They had fought the cold, the enemy, and their own fears. And in the end, that was what had brought them victory. Harris turned away from the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The snow was still falling, the world still silent and cold. There would be more battles, more enemies, more challenges ahead. But for now, for this moment, they had won. And that victory, small and hard-earned as it was, would stay with them forever. "Let's get moving," Harris said, his voice steady, though his body ached with exhaustion. "We've got a long road ahead." As the men gathered their supplies and prepared to move, Harris allowed himself one final look at the battlefield. The wreckage of war, the quiet aftermath, was all that remained. But for him and his crew, it was a reminder that even in the most unforgiving of places, they had found a way to fight, to survive, and to win.